Welcome everybody to this 30th webinar in the discussion series on tipping elements, the notion of irreversibility and abrupt changes in the Earth system. So I'm going to be the host of this session here, and my name is Ulrike Feudel. I'm a full professor for theoretical physics and complex systems at the Karl von Ossietzky University in Oldenburg. My main work concerns analysis of nonlinear dynamical systems with applications in environmental science. Tipping points, or more general tipping phenomena or critical transitions, is one of my major research topics at the moment, and we develop mathematical and computational methods to tackle the identification, classification, and calculation of tipping. In particular, we are interested in applications in climate and ecosystems to derive conditions under which tipping occurs and what are the mechanisms, how they occur. So our today's topic in this seminar is tipping points across scales, complexity in social and ecological systems. The goal of this discussion today in this series is to advance knowledge on tipping elements, support efforts to increase consistency in treatment of tipping elements in the scientific community, develop a research agenda, and design joint experiments and ideas for a tipping point modeling intercomparison project. The network behind this series is the Earth Commission, AIMS, that means the Analysis, Integration, and Modeling of Earth System Project, and both of them are hosted by Future Earth. Then also the Safe Landing Climate's Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program is in this network. The event here is co-organized by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the Global Systems Institute at University of Exeter. So we will have two presentations today. Each of them is 20 minutes long. So they are given by Ricardo Martinez Garcia and Vitor Vasconcelos. And I will introduce them later on, but I would like to remind you, so to say, that there will be a discussion session at the end of the two talks. And there is a Q&A box, which you would see. And I would like to ask you that you put your questions for this Q&A session, which is after the two talks, so in this Q&A session. But both our speakers will present before that session, so we take the questions finally together. So if you have an urgent question, feel free to pose the questions or indicate also to whom your question is directed to using this Q&A session. So we will now get to this question, to the question and the discussion session following the presentations. And so we will also record this session, and so we will have the slides later on so that they will be accessible for the future. So now let me introduce our first speaker, and this is Ricardo Martinez. And Ricardo is an interdisciplinary researcher working at the intersection of biology, mathematics, physics, environmental science, and computer science at the Helmholtz Zentrum Dresden-Rossendorf. His research focuses on understanding the pattern and behaviors of complex living systems across scales, from microbial communities to ecosystems. He studies how interactions among the individuals, like cells, animals, and plants, with each other and the environment lead to higher levels of organization and cascading effects on populations and ecosystems. So Ricardo combines theoretical models with empirical data to make predictions, often collaborating also with experimentalists. His work explores self-organized emergent patterns in ecology, developing theory using methods from statistical physics and nonlinear dynamics, while also investigating natural systems to test these principles across the different scales. So now, Ricardo, please start. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ulrika, for the nice introduction. And also I would like to thank the organizers of this event for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be part of it and be able to share with all of you a little bit of the work that we are doing, but also I would like to give a broader overview of why using spatial patterns is interesting to understand ecological transitions. So most of the work that most of the things that I'm going to show today are related to theory development. But I want to make the point that the reason why this is going to be so heavily relying on theory is because it's a research topic in which incorporating data is an extremely challenging thing that we are trying to do. But it's very challenging, and I would like to also make that point, and maybe hopefully at the end we can discuss on ways of overcoming that challenge, mixing all the expertises that I'm pretty sure we have together in the room. So spatial patterns are are a property that is very common in complex systems. So we can think of complex systems as an entity of many different entities interacting with each other in ways that usually are very complicated. And as a result of those interactions, sometimes we have the emergence of structures like the ones that you see now in the screen as a few examples. So you have here five different examples of ecological systems where interactions, for example, between mussels and the marine currents and the amount of algae that they get in the ocean creates this highly regular spatial structure. We have similarly regular patterns also in salt marshes, in coral reefs, in seagrasses, and one of my favorites is this ecosystem in northeast Brazil, where the effect of wind on the sand, together with the flooding seasons in the region, creates this amazingly regular pattern of dunes of sand filled with water that creates these small ponds where we have a very interesting ecological system. But today I want to talk a little bit about one specific example that we are very interested in. I think it's an extremely interesting system where we also find this patterning phenomenon. And that system is drylands. So drylands are a very common ecosystem in the land surface. They occupy around 40% of the terrestrial area surface, and they are home to around 35% of the global population. What is even more interesting or more important is that in the countries or in the regions where we find drylands, people usually rely on ecosystem services for their well-being and for development in general. So therefore, understanding dryland dynamics is not only a very important environmental problem because they are very prone to extinction system, but it's also a very important socio-economical one because if drylands collapse, then a lot of people will suffer its consequences. And in particular, I want to focus on one property that we find in drylands, which is that very often when we look on satellite images on how vegetation looks like in these regions, we find some of these regular structures that I was mentioning before. So vegetation in these regions, because of the way it competes for water mainly, creates regular structures like the ones that you see in the screen. So, for example, we have some examples of a specific pattern that became very, very famous in the last years. It's called the fairy circles. Maybe for some of you in the audience are familiar with it, which consists basically on a homogeneous layer of vegetation with some holes of bare soil regularly distributed over it. We also have this kind of a spotted pattern, which is more or less the inverse of the fairy circles. We have all the bare soil, and then we have the spots of vegetation regularly distributed over the soil. And we also have this kind of labyrinthic pattern where vegetation spreads with kind of a fingering spatial distribution. So something that is very interesting, and you can see that in this, comparing these two examples from Israel and Niger, is that sometimes we have patterns that visually look the same, but they have very, very different characteristic spatial scales, which depends most of the times on the species that is creating the pattern. So here in Israel, you see that the pattern is on the order of centimeters, whereas here is on the order of a couple hundred meters, the characteristic spatial scale. So that already tells us that there may be something that goes beyond the specific properties of the species that is creating these patterns, and maybe something broader, something more general, or something more fundamental that could explain us something important about the functioning of drylands. But so far, all I'm showing you is pretty pictures. So why, if we are interested in understanding ecological phenomena, should we care about these pretty pictures, right? So a very important observation that triggered a lot of interest in the ecological community is that the shape of these patterns, so these kind of fairy circles, labyrinth spot shapes that I was showing you before, they correlate a lot with the amount of water. So what you see now in the screen is data from a study location in Sudan, where we have a very well-defined aridity gradient from southeast to northwest. And as we move across this gradient, we see that the shape of the pattern is changing consistently from gaps, which we find in regions with more water, to labyrinths, to finally spots when we reach the driest region in this environmental gradient. So that opened a lot of interesting ideas regarding the use of these patterns as an indicator of these changes in water availability and approximation of critical transitions, or tipping, using the word that is the key word for today, in drylands. So trying to understand these patterns, I am moved, and I think there are two fundamental questions that we should try to address if we want to understand this particular phenomenon, which we can extend to almost any spatial patterning process in ecological systems that we may want to look at. The first question is related, of course, to understanding what are the causes of these patterns. So what are the mechanisms that are creating these structures and its correlation with the water availability? And the second one is related to the consequences of patterning in these drylands. So what is that this ecosystem is changing in its functioning just because of the self-organization of the emergence of these self-organized patterns. And these two questions are going to drive the rest of my presentation today. So, as I was mentioning before, once we have this observation, and once we have these two questions, an ideal way of trying to tackle that maybe would be trying to collect data on how these patterns are changing over time, as we have increasing amount of data on how environmental conditions are changing. The problem is that these patterns, they are huge, and they change over extremely slow temporal scales. So we don't really have enough data to track the change of these patterns over time. If we look across time, for as long as we go back on time as far as we can with current data sets, we just don't see significant changes in these patterns. So that opened the door for theoretical modeling, for trying to make a hypothesis with theoretical models. And there are mainly two, there is a very well accepted, let's say, hypothesis on how these patterns are forming, which is related to the way plants are competing and using water. So the phenomenon that the phenomenon that people are, or the mechanism that people are using to explain these patterns, is what we like to call the scale-dependent feedback, that basically consists on an effect on the presence of vegetation over water, in a way that water is vegetation is sucking water from its neighborhood via the roots, and it's taking it towards the region of the crown. And then when water is in the crown, there is better conditions for it for more vegetation to grow, and that is creating a sort of long-range inhibitory feedback that impedes the growth of vegetation far away from where I have vegetation, and a positive feedback where I have more vegetation. And that kind of a scale dependence is leading to an interaction force between plants that change with sign as we go farther away from focal plant, and that is making the homogeneous distribution of vegetation, to be unstable. So these models are very successful at recapitulating this correlation between pattern shape and the shape of and water availability, But because with models we can play around and we can manipulate the conditions and we can make hypotheses about different scenarios, they also predict something that was very interesting and triggered a lot of research in the years after these models were introduced. And it is the fact that once the system is in this spot pattern, that if you remember is the last one that we find when we move across an aridity gradient, If the precipitation continues to decrease, this model predicts that ecosystems should tip, should lose all their biomass in an abrupt way and become deserts, basically. The problem again is lack of data, and it's not only lack of observational data on how these drylands change over time, but it's also lack of experimental data on whether these mechanisms are creating the pattern. So these mechanisms are there, they can be measured for sure, but there's no way so far of measuring whether they are responsible for the pattern. So the problem is that once we lack this empirical confirmation, we can easily come up with an alternative model in which we, for example, switch off the positive feedback. So now all the interactions between plants are always competition. And those models still recover this correlation between pattern shape, but now they lose this abrupt desertification transition. And this is a very, very important difference because it's from any applied point of view, either ecological or also conservational or restore, or if we want to restore these drylands, it is not the same restoring a dryland that has undergone an abrupt loss of vegetation, for which we have to introduce way more vegetation in order to recover the original system, than recovering one that has undergone a continuous transition. So this lack of data is already creating some lack of consensus in the theory. The problem is that as we have models, then we attract the attention of a lot of highly skilled mathematicians that try to understand way, way better how these models are behaving. So these further mathematical analysis led to the finding that actually what these spatial patterns could do in the ecosystems, and this is what you see now in the screen, is that they could be giving them a way of avoiding desertification as a tipping process. So what people found in these models is that basically when we have an ecosystem that has an homogeneous cover of vegetation and the conditions get worse and worse and worse, eventually, in response to this increased stress, the system could develop spatial patterns and then could explore a whole new region of possible configurations that allows them to be more adaptive, if you want, or more plastic to the presence of these external perturbations, these worsening conditions that could allow them to completely escape the tipping point and go towards the desert state in a very, very smooth way, in accordance with some of the previous models as well. Recently, there's been a very interesting review perspective paper that was published in Science 4 years ago now, is this reference here, where they proposed that actually spatially extended ecosystems could be so complex that they could have a lot of different stable states coexisting with each other. And this is the phenomenon that Ulrike was alluding in her introduction on her research. So these systems could be highly multi-stable, which means that perturbations could be buffered in very different ways, leading to very, very different spatial distributions of vegetation that would make this system extremely resilient. So overall, although we don't have data to test many of these predictions, the consensus in the community is that a spatial pattern is a response to increased environmental stress. So when drylands become drier and drier and drier, they develop specific spatial patterns that allow them to cope with these worse conditions. And the second point of agreement is that somehow, because these patterns are an indication of increasing stress, we could use them for something ecologically meaningful. The problem, again, and I want to emphasize this point many, many times, is the lack of data sets to test all these predictions. And this is an even more important problem when one starts to think critically about many of the assumptions that we often use to develop this theory. And I say we because I list myself as someone developing mainly theory for this specific system. And most of these models are developed in highly, highly idealized conditions, such as, for example, assuming that ecosystems are infinitely large, that all the conditions are homogeneous all over the place, and we know that's not true. And two examples are, for example, what you will see now in the screen, with two study cases that we have identified in Niger, in this 2021 paper, where you see that we do have self-organized structures of vegetation, but they are living in very finite domains, in very finite regions, surrounded by unvegetated regions. So, for example, this assumption of infinite systems is broken or it's violated in many, many examples. Another clear assumption that is not so correct to assume in many systems is this assumption of homogeneity. It's the assumption that everything is perfectly homogeneous all over the space. And by everything, I mean things like water infiltration or water runoff and many other environmental parameters that for anyone that is not a theoretician would be very, very, very weird to assume homogeneity, but many models do assume homogeneity. And one example is, for example, this study site in Sudan again, where you see that the vegetation is mostly forming stripes, but there are two regions in which it's forming two vortices that are correlated with higher elevation in the terrain. So basically what we have here is two hills, and on the top of the hill, the stripes of vegetation become more close rings following the slope, and then the shape of the pattern changes as we move downhill. So the introducing this data set that we do have, so we do have data set for topography into existing models is something we can do. And it's something we are starting to do now, and it's something I would like to discuss with you, to show you briefly for the last part of my presentation, so you get an idea on the small efforts that we are trying to do into going closer to reality, and how tiny modifications on the general assumptions that existing theories make change a lot of conclusions that we are heavily relying on. So together with David, who is a postdoc in my group in Casus, we asked this question of how topography or heterogeneous water vegetation feedbacks, together with not considering infinite systems, so considering that vegetation is really living in small places surrounded by desert, changes the role of patterns regarding how they can inform about the resilience of drylands. So I'm not going to show any equation. I was aiming to interact with a very interdisciplinary audience, but if you are interested in knowing something about the math, some more specific things, I'm very happy to either discuss later or to follow up via email. What I'm going to show you basically is the predictions that we can make about the role of the patterns when we have ideal conditions and when we don't have ideal conditions. And again, by not ideal conditions, what I mean is finite domains and heterogeneous conditions in space. So just to set it as a basis for comparison, basically what we are going to do is we are going to integrate these models with a computer. We are going to run simulations, and we are going to look at how our ecosystem is going to change as we move an environmental stress parameter. So this is the kind of diagrams that we are going to be looking at. In the horizontal axis, you have environmental stress. So as we move to the right, we have worse conditions. And on the y-axis, you have amount of biomass. So how much biomass we have in our patch. So the green points are the solutions of our model. So as we increase the environmental stress, you see that we are losing a lot of vegetation biomass. And eventually, when we are below some environmental quality, then the whole vegetation dies, and we have the classical tipping desertification process. And this happens in the classical models when everything is homogeneous. So interactions between plants are reciprocal because I have this symmetry in space that allows me to change plants without losing any type of interaction. And when I relax this assumption and I introduce this sort of non-reciprocity in interactions, which basically means heterogeneities in space that makes some places worse than others in space, what we see is that now I, of course, continue to lose vegetation when the environmental stress becomes worse, environmental stress increases, sorry. And now I lose all the vegetation at a much higher environmental quality than before. So I need less environmental stress to lose the full ecosystem. The reason for this shift is that now, because my system is living surrounded by a desert, the mechanism that is making is causing this loss of vegetation. It's not the classical tipping in which I lose all plants, but it is the propagation of the desert into the patch of the vegetation. because I have these spatial heterogeneity conditions that allow this wave of desertification to travel into the region where I had vegetation before. And that kind of instability, that desertification process, happens according to theory, of course, at much lower levels of environmental stress than when I have these perfect conditions in theory. So this is a quantitative difference. So in principle, okay, it's fine. Anyway, we don't know how to map environmental stress 0.1 to measurable parameters so far. So okay, it's quantitative. We are more or less safe. The problem is when we look at situations where I have these spatial patterns and I repeat the same type of analysis, what I find is that, first of all, if I have these ideal conditions, my system is living up to much better conditions than before. And by before, now I'm representing this black line. So this was the tipping point that we had before. As you see now, because of the presence of the patterns, my system lives at much higher levels of environmental stress, which is fine. It's in accordance with the theory that we were reviewing before. It's a state-of-the-art knowledge, and it's not challenging any of the conclusions that we had so far. When I relax these assumptions, I see that even in the presence of patterns, my system loses a lot of resilience. So it's going to collapse at much lower levels of environmental stress. As you see now already, just by visual comparison, the loss of resilience is much higher when I have patterns than when I didn't have patterns. And this is a very interesting observation because it's telling us, first of all, that even though both types of configurations, non-patterns on the left and patterns on the right, they lose resilience when conditions are not ideal in the model, when I try to introduce these little bits of realism in my models. And by little bits of realism, I mean a little bit of topography plus regions of vegetation living surrounded by deserts. The sensitivity that these two configurations have to changes in the environmental conditions is very different. So the last thing I want to show you, and it's the main take-home message that I would like to stress, is that once we have this different sensitivity, we can try to explore broader and see what are the consequences of this higher sensitivity. So can I reverse this general conclusion that we were saying before in terms of patterns giving ecosystems, giving drylands a higher level of resilience? So we can do that if we look at which kind of spatial configurations of vegetation can survive as a function of different environmental stress and different intensities of non-reciprocity. And by intensities of non-reciprocity, remember that I mean different levels, for example, of topography, different levels of heterogeneity in environmental conditions in space. So when my conditions, my reciprocity is very low, or so to say, the topography is non-existent, I have a flat system, a flat landscape, for example, I have the typical configuration, the typical scenario that we had been discussing in the beginning of the presentation. So when the environmental stress is very low, any type of spatial configuration can survive, but then in response to environmental stress, the system would develop patterns, and eventually, in response to higher stress, it will collapse, and only bare soil configurations will survive. With this more general theory, what we can do is we can look at the effect of topography. And when we increase topography, for example, what we see is that there is a region, there is a moment at which this idea of patterns being more resistant than non-pattern configurations is violated. So basically, in this whole red region here, we have conditions in which these desertification fronts would be able to kill ecosystems where vegetation is almost homogeneously, where vegetation is forming these spatial patterns, but would not kill vegetation that is uniformly distributed. So in this region here, uniformly distributed vegetation is more resistant to increase in stress than patterns. So with that, I just want to finish with a little bit of a key point summary in case I lose some of many of you in the way, key take-home messages is that accounting for more realism into theoretical models that we have to study the role of spatial patterning into ecosystem resilience completely changes the general ideas that we thought we had so far. And as an example, when we introduce this lack of non-homogeneity in environmental conditions, patterns could actually indicate lack of resilience in the system rather than an increased resilience in the system. So with that, I just want to thank the funding that makes possible our work, and I will be very happy to take any question after Victor's talk. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for this very interesting talk on vegetation patterns. And I would like to remind you, please use the Q&A session to put your questions. So you can do it, so to say, all the time. But let me now introduce Vitor, who is the next speaker in our session here. Vitor Vasconcelos, is an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, where he works at the Computational Science Lab at the Informatics Institute. His research focuses on developing models of human collective behavior to better understand and address the consequences of interventions in complex social systems. Through mathematical and computational methods, along with experiments and observations, he explores interconnected systems involving humans, resources, and governments to tackle global challenges like climate change and misinformation. Vitor co-leads the Polder Initiative at the Institute for Advanced Study and coordinates the Complex Systems and Policy Master's Program at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies. So for the audience, so if you're interested in such master programs, this is quite new, so he asked us to advertise this here. So he previously held positions as a visiting research scholar at Princeton University's Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment and the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies after completing his PhD in sciences at the University of Minho. Now, so he is going to present the second talk, so please start, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation. So in this talk, I will briefly share some of the insights that we've gathered when studying social systems, and I'll focus on some of the properties of social systems that make them, for me, so interesting, but also very challenging to tackle. Let me see if I can... So the context of this type of tipping, which is often called the social tipping, has to do with thinking of social norms as solutions for behavioral change. So to address complex challenges like climate change mitigation, we want to ideally imagining a world where small and seemingly insignificant choices, they suddenly come together and shift societal behaviors, where this collective behavior that defines the culture in general, they are not some inevitable product of some grand design or a grand designer, but they actually emerge from the countless individual decisions that people make and that influence each other. So people think of social norms as solutions for this behavioral change, and social norms are these unwritten rules that govern and describe the behaviors within communities. Some examples of these have to do with the sustainable behaviors, but also, as we saw, for instance, during the COVID pandemic, we saw a normalization of working remotely, of giving talks remotely. We saw also some normalization of not going to work when you're sick, etc. So different types of phenomena that benefit to society. Of course, social norms can also be negative and associated with negative, harmful traditions. So they always have these dual sense. For this perspective of tipping, social norms can be seen as what enforces these multiple equilibrium solutions. So typically, when a whole population has a given norm, it's very hard for a single individual to deviate from that norm, stabilizing the system in that situation. And so a change in that social norm could help explain these sudden shifts typically associated with tipping. Of course, contrary to many of the systems, including the ones that Ricardo mentioned, these social systems are also heterogeneous, and we don't see heterogeneity as a bug, actually, but as an important feature of these social systems. So often we look at different studies where minority opinions or behaviors, they can eventually cascade. And it's the heterogeneity that comes from those individuals that eventually cascades throughout the whole population. Just to give you a sense, often when people talk about the social tipping, they think about, we often think about the stability solutions. So there's maybe like a critical parameter that is changing at some point in time, maybe everything suddenly shifts. Of course, in reality, things happen a bit more slowly. But as probably many people in the audience know, this might not be in sufficient condition to be considered tipping as opposed to just a fast transition. So I'll just give you some intuition on why we can see a faster and faster transition, but maybe that does not necessarily equate to tipping. So individual behavior has often been studied in terms of the many factors that contribute to behavioral change or behavioral adoption. So, for instance, we can look at different costs of a technology, the health benefits that it produces, the conditions that surround the individual, how they contribute to that decision making, what is the current behavior that the individual is doing, and that it's typically in a framework that is more or less linear, that looks at, for instance, the value of an option as a combination of costs and benefits. Those costs can come from many different factors. These factors might even interact with each other. Say costs, of course, have to do with price, but could also be other costs. Social factors can contribute to costs or benefits. And the same thing happens to all alternative options. So here I'm just considering two for simplicity. And of course, individuals take decisions not based on these objective values, but on what they perceive that these values are. So, of course, human biases can also come into place into what finally comes up as a decision that the individual makes. So, for simplicity, let's take one of these factors, say cost. And we have one single individual. If I look at, let's say, price, if I look at price over time, I can imagine a scenario where, for external reasons, the price of a product is decreasing. Yeah, over time we see that on the plot on the left. Now let's say we have one individual, John. John has a specific willingness to pay for that product. So when the price hits that value at that specific moment in time, then we expect a change in behavior for John. So John goes from not buying the product to buying the product. Of course, when we have a very large population, there are many Johns. So we can think that different people have different willingness to pay. And that willingness to pay will result in heterogeneous moments in which individuals adopt. So if you have a distribution of willingness to pay, say on the left, here we see that a lot of people have this intermediate willingness to pay, and then there are some tails, not necessarily Gaussian, not necessarily unimodal, and we have an external forcing of the price over time. Maybe you can say, then we can say, what is the adoption of the collective of all these people? And you see immediately that, okay, whether a transition is fast or not, It depends on whether the price is changing quickly or not. And the second, whether your system is more homogeneous or not. So if your system is very homogeneous, you'll have a peak in a specific point of price. And at that specific point in price, you will see a lot of people adopting this. Does that mean tipping? Well, probably not. Let's see. So the first thing that you can think is that, well, actually, the fact that the price hit that value, it doesn't mean that individuals will immediately adopt. So there is a scale separation that has to do with how often individuals make this decision regarding what they're doing or what product they are buying, what services they're using compared to the price. So how often individuals make that choice is an important factor, of course. That's fairly trivial. A more important assumption has to do with like what kind of information they have. If individuals, even though the price is decaying, if individuals don't even know about the product, maybe on the right-hand side, what you expect is no adoption, right? If at some moment the whole community learns about that product, then we see the product adoption going back to where it was. So maybe in terms of information, there might be some type of cascade that could have some criticality. So just for illustration, I have here, I'm going to try to pause. I'm going to try to pause. I cannot pause. So we will just keep looking at it a few times. So here I'm representing what could be a community of individuals, which are these circles. And these individuals can be uninformed about some product, which were the open circles at the beginning. At some point, they might become informed. And later on, they might actually adopt the technology if it's important for them, or if it's cheap enough in the case of the example that I was giving before. So what you see is actually in the beginning, there's some spread of information, and at moments in time, you see these pulses where information cascades throughout the population. And of course, when we think about information, often this process is irreversible. When you look at whether you know something, whether that information has reached a specific point, that becomes often irreversible at some time scale. Okay. So maybe the process of information is can be considered tipping point, but the adoption, not really, because if we take this heterogeneous population that is making decisions based on these prices, maybe even based on the information that they have, if price goes back up and individuals can reassess their strategy, then what we see is that the individuals that are no longer willing to pay for that service, they will stop paying for that service. So the main point for clarification is that, no, this is not, these are not the necessary ingredients for considering these social tipping points, because even though you have these fast transitions and you can have faster and faster transitions and close to discontinuities in these systems, they are completely reversible at exactly the same point. So what are we missing? Well, of course, this might sound trivial after the previous talk, is really these feedbacks that we are missing. So individuals make decisions not only based on the properties of these products, but also based on the decisions of others. And because each individual is part of the others, for others, there will be some type of feedback. So the decision that you take now will influence what others do. So, and that's where traditionally this social feedback that has been described many, many years ago, probably in the 50s, you go into models by Roger, for instance, that look at technology adoption through this phenomena of, for instance, word of mouth, where people tell each other about something and that propagates. And they describe this and categorize the individuals in terms of innovators, early adopters, majorities, late majorities, and so on. But then the model that, or the types of models that usually come are quite simple. So they have, this is the only equation I have today, is a model that describes the change in a fraction of individuals adopting. And it basically has two terms. A term of imitation, where if I find someone that is not that is adopting the technology, and I'm not, there's a chance that I'll start doing it. And there's also an innovation term. But what we see is that there are two issues. First is that, the propagation process is very simple. There's no decision making. It doesn't take into account all the factors that we talked before, including different prices. And then, well, where are the innovators? Who are the innovators? Actually, all the individuals here are exactly the same. It only happens that, some of them start by adopting first, and then because there's enough people to imitate, that grows fast, and then at the end it needs to grow slower because there's not more people to take that. So these are some of the key ingredients about human behavior, and people have distinguished these propagation behavior into two classes: the simple contagions, like I was describing here, and like I described the information propagation earlier on, but also the behavioral change. And behavioral change has been characterized as complex contagion, where individuals actually need multiple reinforcements from their networks before they start adopting a specific behavior. You can imagine the case of an app where you talk to others. Of course, if enough people are using that, only if enough of your friends are using that app, you will switch to a different app to communicate. Otherwise, it makes no sense, right? So, and this is the case for many behaviors, which brings us to also a very old model of reinforcement. This is a threshold model, where there is a critical number of individuals that are required to be around you, adopting that behavior for you to do that behavior. And more recently, people have derived from, again, theoretical perspective, from this rational choice model that I described it earlier, this critical threshold above which individuals will start doing something. So overall, just to give you a little flavor, is that to make a decision, and this is in a utility-based framework, which is just an example, you can think, I'll compare two products by looking at their utility. The utility of A has to do with all the features that A has and how much I value those features. But also the social influence that I get from A and how much I value that. And the same for feature B. And these are the key ingredients that we have been looking at for human behavior. So in what comes next, I wanted to very briefly go through some of the works that we have done. So in the first one, we look at a situation in which individuals all agree what the best option is, but they agree to different extents, and there is a risk associated with taking that option. And we look at the role of heterogeneity of these preferences, of clustering of individuals, and also of segregation of these networks. And we do that both with the model and empirically. Later, we take a case where these preferences are actually shifting over time. For instance, in the case of decaying prices, and how specific types of incentives and behaviors, or even types of individuals, can help facilitate the whole population into expressing their evolving preferences. And then finally, just very briefly, some work, if there's time, some work on once we know that we have social tipping and that cascades can happen and they are irreversible, can we leverage that in order to decide who to target and where to intervene in these social networks so that the system organically evolves towards its desired state, if that's a positive state, of course. So in the first paper, we look at how different properties of the individuals interact. So the properties that we looked at are on the top left, we see these valuations. So do individuals value option A more or less? Do they all value them equally or not? So we can control the distribution of valuations. And these individuals are in social networks. In tight communities, let's say, everyone knows each other, everyone can connect to each other, they know exactly what the preferences or the valuations of everyone are. But in larger communities, those can also be segregated. And once you have segregated communities, you can also think about where are the different valuations in this population. You can imagine, so that's scenario C here. You can imagine that you have a case where the network is segregated, so they don't know about everyone else, but they have a good sample of the population, so they are quite mixed, or the preferences are actually such that the people who the people who prefer a little are on the left, and the people who prefer a lot are on the right. So with the model and with the experiments that validate the model, what we find is that on the left we have homogeneous populations, and on the right we have heterogeneous populations and different levels of preferences. What we find is that, of course, just segregation on its own can hamper the ability of this community to choose the option that they all prefer and that they all agree that they prefer to different extents. Once you start losing some information about what others are doing, risk kicks in and disables this. So you can imagine now that as you rewire this population, you can allow it to be better at solving these issues and then stimulating such a transition between these two stable states. Then when you have heterogeneous preferences, actually the worst situation is when you have the segregated population with the preferences also segregated in the system, where you have some individuals investing for no reason, so taking the gamble that the others will also do it and actually ending up worse. For this, so when we have these evolving preferences now, this other study that we have, we consider, for instance, a case of, say, decaying prices, where the preference shifts from one side, well, everyone prefers one thing, to a side where people prefer the opposite. So let's say you take a population, and if everyone has incentives to do what others around them are doing in some heterogeneous network, you can end up in a situation where everyone is doing blue, option, in this case, option A, but some individuals prefer option B, right? So here highlighted with the red circle. So they prefer option B, but because everyone is doing option A, because of these the benefits that they get from aligning with others, they actually don't do it. Now, imagine that we have a different type of individual that does not have incentives to align with others, but has incentives to misalign with others. And these are the square, which we will call anticonformists. In the first case, you see that the choices are, well, everyone is blue, but the preferences, some people are doing what they prefer, some people are not. If we introduce this anticonformist here in the middle, then what we'll see is that because at first this anticonformist is surrounded by blue, they will become red. Because the other people around them have incentives to align, they will become red, and in the end they will flip back to blue because that's what they prefer. And so in the end, you can actually get the population to align. And what we see is the critical point at which you need to introduce these individuals in order to see tipping from one case, from one situation to the other. Here we have an heterogeneous network, a finite network, so this critical transition is smoothened out, but in a mean field description, you would see this as a critical irreversible transition. And while we look at the placement of these individuals in the network can actually be very important. So in this case, we see that around 20 or 30% is the necessary number of individuals to have the system go from not aligning, or only half of the people aligning with their preference, to everyone aligning with their preference. But we can also correlate the position of these special nodes in the social network. So if we make them more central, we can see, so the zero line here actually maps exactly to this transition where we need around 20-something% for it to happen. As we make them more central, we can see a decrease in the number of these individuals from all the way from 20% to 5%. So the placement of these individuals in these social networks is really crucial, which also tells us that, you know, anticipating what will actually happen in reality is going to be quite challenging and will require a lot of data, like Ricardo was saying earlier. So here, I for the sake of time, I will skip quickly through this. So here you say that we can say that 0 is the neutral preference of the population, and we can let a population have decreasing preferences. So if we let this run over time from some here arbitrary initial condition, we see that at first the number of individuals, when there's very few anti-conformists, the population at first stabilizes until the preferences are really the other way, and then it finally starts converging to the other equilibrium. But if we include more of these individuals, the transition actually much more closely tracks the preferences of these individuals. And this can happen also in the case of oscillatory behavior. I'm not going to go in detail into this. We've been looking into where to intervene, but maybe for the sake of time, one thing that I wanted to share with you is actually what we have been doing in practice. So how do we take all of this and do actionable models? So we are running this center where we use input from many different stakeholders to address specific questions. Here is the case of how people's behaviors change regarding where they source their protein from. So the techniques are quite simple. So we start with a round of participatory modeling, where we bring input from different perspectives and different backgrounds, so we can understand what are the different factors that motivate people to act. Then using protocols that we're developing, we turn those perspectives into computational models. We derive some hypotheses for where these behaviors could change and where, if there are tipping points or not. And then we test those with the small-scale empirical experiments to understand whether the system is doing what we want. This is just a simple description of that. This empirical research is going to be really important because it then needs to be done in a way that cuts across the scale. So how do we scale this up? We start local with the local stakeholders, and we need to multiply this into different cities. In this case, we're working with the municipalities. And once we understand what features of the individuals across different cities are driving the behavior, then we can leverage this understanding to see whether at the global system there is also tipping, or if this tipping is localized only in specific communities and remains restricted there. And with that, I will leave some time to discussion. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this interesting talk in a totally different area of human behavior. And so we are now starting the discussion session. And so this is my reminder again, so to say, please use the Q&A window. So you find it on the bottom of your Zoom to click on it and to write some questions. And so to wait for some more questions to pop up. So I will maybe ask a question to each of our speakers here so that people can still, so to say, come up with questions during that time. So I start maybe with the last talk. My question would be, so to say, related with the type of topologies you are using. So because what we have seen is networks where you have agents in some connectivity, but one of them seemed to be a kind of random network. The other one was a fully connected one. But so, of course, there are many different topologies possible. And I would guess that this kind of cascading behavior is really dependent on what type of topology you have and how do you design the coupling. So how would you do that in your model and with what type of consequences?
Yes, this is an excellent question that is very deeply in our mind when we are addressing all of these. So you can imagine that maybe for the spatial pattern we would have some type of a lattice, but here for the social influence, the space is actually defined by this social network, right? And so when we look into first simple models, but also in the experiments, what we look to do is to cover a range of topologies. So there's typically extreme cases of topologies with very heterogeneous degree distributions, like a scale-free distribution, but also the random graph, like you were saying earlier, that has much more homogeneous degree distributions. And of course, there's always influence that with the density of these networks is a very important parameter to have this cascade happening. And that's why I think it's really important to actually start very simple and start with a mean field model for how all of this happens, so we actually have a baseline to know whether we would expect tipping, where we would expect multiple stable points, and then start introducing these topologies. Once we do that, we also, for instance, for the case of the optimal incentives, we can see where to intervene, given the type of network, is it generalizable across networks or not, but also use not only these stylized models of networks, but use also some empirical networks that have, of course, some arbitrary topology, but that reflects human interactions. So that's how we tackle this problem. And of course, as you mentioned, a lot of these phenomena, cascading phenomena, they also relate very closely with the percolation theory, where there's already a lot of results on when to expect these cascades to actually go somewhere or not. Once we include a lot of heterogeneity also on the nodes themselves, then this gets a bit trickier. But again, starting with the baseline is really important.
Thank you very much. Now comes a question for Ricardo. You spoke about the different sensitivities of the different patterns. So can you compute these for your vegetation models, and does it relate somehow to the density of your vegetation? So is there a relationship between the different sensitivities and what is the type of pattern you observe? And so can one derive from this type of knowledge also some strategies, so to say, to see also so how patterns more or less, so this front propagation is also influenced by the type of patterns and the type of sensitivities. So can you comment on this? So what is this relationship?
Yes, so it's very interesting because what we find is that the configurations that are more sensitive to the presence of deserts around them, and therefore more likely to be invaded by the certification front, are the ones that tend to produce more biomass as a consequence of spatial patterning. So what we think is happening is that somehow the system is so strongly relying on the spatial configuration that it has, that as soon as it has some external perturbation from the outside that tweaks a little bit the spatial arrangement, then there is a cascade across the system that makes the whole vegetation to collapse. So It's very interesting because it's related to some of the ideas that Victor was discussing in his presentation, although for us space is just land, and for them it's a network of interactions. At the end, you can map our problem to a network of patches of vegetation that are interacting between them. And some of the ideas that we are trying to explore is how topography is making this network heterogeneity and therefore more likely to cascades of death, if you want, or cascades of desertification that propagate across the patch. So it's basically, it's very interesting. So what we are finding is the more the system relies on a spatial configuration for survival, of course, the more sensitive it is to perturbations.
Yeah, thank you very much. So there is another question which goes probably to Vitor. So the question is about the model, so to say, the model for this technology and adoption. So how is it influenced by false information? You said information processing is very important in your system. So how does it react to false information? So which could be adopted as well. So which influence the whole process. And another point to this model is also so how you could discuss the whole thing in the context of environmental degradation, climate change, wealth, or inequalities in the context of your economic system.
Yeah. Now that's an excellent question too. So false information is really critical for these systems, and it can be used to manipulate or to control behavior in these populations. So understanding how much it can do, I think it's really critical for these systems. So that's where this type of modeling can actually be very useful to highlight how important this type of phenomena is. We've looked into, for instance, different biases that information can come with, and that does lead to a lot of big impacts in terms of the population's inability to do what they want. In the context of inequalities and all that, I think it becomes really crucial to, besides having the homogeneous models and so on, to include the heterogeneity of the individuals' behaviors and individuals' motivations and individuals' needs to adopt a specific technology. Also, cultural factors are really interesting. And they play a very big role in generating the heterogeneity. Luckily, there's ways of combining all that. Of course, the data defines the distribution of that. But in the end, if you are interested in the adoption or not of a specific technology, then in the end, all you need to resort to is some kind of effective behavior. What is the requirement for the agent to be able to flip? And so that becomes a very specific condition that allows you to then study this across the population. Of course, still understanding what are the multiple factors that allow for this, but that in the end allow the system to move where it wants to move without a grand controller telling people exactly what they should do. I don't know if that answered the question completely, but
so there are two other modeling questions, which go in the direction. So what kind of models do you use to model human behavior? So is there any specific model behind it? And how do you take into consideration that people are heterogeneous and also their interactions are heterogeneous?
Yeah. It's not like we use a specific model. So for a model comes with a question. So depending on the question that we pose to the system, we can develop a new model. I think, for instance, what I use today as an illustration, you would say that it's a discrete choice model. where you have in the case of the example I gave was two options, and then you are evaluating all these two options with all its factors. Yeah, it's very close to rational choice theory, yeah, discrete choice model, but you can use different types of models as long as the resulting effective behavior is that there is a dependency in the number of neighbors acting, and that dependency is monotonic, either up or down. I think that is what narrows down the scope of all of these results. So the first question was about if there was a type of model. The second.
So the first question was about the model for the human behavior.
Yeah, in this case was discrete choice model, I would say. Yeah, but you can also use other things as long as they have specific properties, let's say.
Okay, so now so we come to a question to Ricardo again. So I read this because this is very subtle question, I would say. And the question is about the tipping point. So which is from humid conditions to arid conditions. And does this tipping point is the same point where the system moves from energy limited conditions to water limited conditions? Or is this completely different?
Sorry, I was mute. So the tipping points that we were looking at and that I was discussing today are tipping points from water limited to desert. So basically, it's a full collapse of these extremely arid ecosystems that we are interested in studying. I know there is some other work of people that, for example, work in looking at how they might be tipping from savannas to grasslands and different alternative stable states in other biomes. The one I was discussing today was not from humid to arid. It was from already an hyper arid ecosystem. So these are ecosystems that many times have like 100 millimeters of rainfall per year, so are really, really hyper arid, and how they collapse to deserts basically.
Mm-hmm. There was another question here, so which does not relate really, so to say, to the two talks, but I will put it in the context, I would say. Here one person is interested in the role of particulate matter in the air, so which could, of course, be relevant for the plants. So if you have a desert, basically, and strong winds, so then of course this particular particulate matter would be able to also have an impact on your plants, on your vegetation growth. Is this somehow taken into account? And what about the increase of global temperatures?
So maybe I can, and then because my answer is gonna relate a little bit, or at least try to provoke a little bit an answer from Victor to this. So that is something that most of the theories for these questions of how spatial patterning in drylands can inform about tipping is that they don't make they rarely take into account the human dimension. No? So anthropogenic pressures or they are, some people look at things like grazing or a human human perturbations, but not at such a larger scale as, for example, with the models that Victor was developing. No? So the short answer is no, we don't take into consideration human actions. Maybe the reason why I thought I could be a bit provocative with Victor is whether they consider somehow feedbacks between human and environmental activities. I know they did at some point, and maybe
Yeah, I think that's it's really challenging. You're right. We started exploring that at some point in what regards to resource extraction and how different even abilities to forecast the behavior of the environment, they can affect the stability of the management strategy. So, and it was in ways that are not so intuitive. So actually, we saw at some point that if you are able to predict the resource dynamics quite well, then that improves the stability of the management of the resource, and this could be like some ecosystem, something you're deriving from an ecosystem with some growth rates and so on, like a fishery or something like that. But if you are also very good at predicting the behavior of others, then that makes it generates some interesting oscillations that we cannot fully understand yet. So yeah.
So here's an interesting question again to the social tipping approach. So could this type of approach and this type of research you do on your decision making also be used to look at a strategic way to shift the mobility behavior in cities from car-dependent society to a society where we have a society where bus, foot, and bike play the major role. Or is it too complex because then there is lots of cultural things which come in, convenience, economic growth, and so on. So could you comment on that? Maybe there is already some research on it, maybe not done by you, but by others, but you might know about it.
Exactly. Yeah, I think being in the Netherlands is a nice it's a nice example where the bike culture is really strong and is for who lives in the city the main mode of transportation. And there is a lot of research being done here, but I agree that it is culture dependent. So I think it is possible to use these, but then in the model itself, the framework, let's say, could be generalized. It is generalizable, but of course the parameterization, the factors that are important, the timing of everything, it will be place dependent. So in that regard, for instance, I don't think that inducing a tipping point can happen at the scale of that community, the city, but it's not like if everyone here adopts the bike, that will cascade throughout the world. So it needs some kind of decentralized study and then decentralized strategic action. Yeah.
So, which is also maybe related, this question is, can societies also tip into the direction of the originally not preferred option?
Yeah, unfortunately. So that was I tried to have a positive spin on this idea of social tipping, but as I started by saying, it has two sides, right? It can tip into the desired state, or it can also tip to an undesired state. Even the idea of expressing preferences, it's challenging, right? Because if we see that through misinformation, like it was said, these preferences are also shifting in a way that will harm society, then there's a lot of interesting ethical questions that one and moral that one can pose. So the short answer is yes. So, and then I guess understanding whether these systems can tip or it's gradual, whether that's reversible or not, is really critical.
So, and there is another question for the couplings in this type of society models. So, are there other couplings between stakeholders beyond structural and functional couplings? Vitor, you are muted. So could you please switch on the microphone again? And answer once again, please.
Yeah, all right. Well, you didn't miss much, because what I was saying is that I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So the structural part I understand through the networks. The functional part is, of course, to do with what individuals are doing. At least that's what I am interpreting. And those, of course, are coupled. There's other types of coupling that I can imagine, but I would still classify them as functional. So, for instance, there's different types of things that might be propagating in these systems, like opinions, attitudes, information. So that I would say, it's some kind of multi-coupling, but it's still the same type of coupling. So, maybe I'm just not being creative enough to think about other types of coupling. But what we've seen that is really important is, besides the traditional functional and structural coupling, it's really important to consider this heterogeneity that I think is shared by these two talks. Like, are the roles of the individuals actually different? Because in what I've shown, it was, this population all had the same roles. Are the individuals different among themselves, even if they share the same role? So I think those are the key insights we've gathered so far from the modeling. From the group model building, there's, of course, always very interesting insights there in terms of the stakeholders, their underlying interests, that often are even unrelated to the system that we're studying.
Thank you. So I don't see any further questions. So therefore, I would like to thank the speakers very much for their excellent and inspiring presentations, and also all the ones who provided questions here for this active and interesting discussion which we had. So many thanks to everyone who is still here in the Zoom session. And as a last point, I would like to invite you to the next event in this discussion series, which is in March. And this will focus on updates on the tipping of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. So this is an ocean circulation in the Atlantic. And so we will discuss here novel insights and connections with extreme events. So far there is no link yet for registration, but so this is showing up soon. And with this, we would like to say goodbye here, and thanks once again to the speakers for their wonderful talks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.